Hey there, creatives. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode 81 of the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I'm your host, Raina Lombardi, and I'm really excited to share this conversation with art therapist Jane Ferris Richardson. Jane is a professor at Lesley University, which is my alma mater, and I'm always excited to talk with people who are connected with the program. It meant so much to me in my education and development and evolution as a therapist. So, always happy to talk with people from there. And Jane is sharing about her latest work, which is called Art as a Language for Autism. And I loved this conversation with Jane. She really shared about um, all of the different ways she incorporates expressive opportunities within her therapy practice. We spent some time talking about the Reggio Emilia approach, which is really about celebrating that expressive language that children have. And she kind of frames this idea that there's multiple languages for expression that have nothing to do with verbal language, and how we're able to utilize those in the work that we do with clients. Um, I hope that you enjoy listening to the show. And yeah, without further ado, here's our conversation.
The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinician's Corner, a practice-building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential-focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Raina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative, focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Raina Lombardi.
Thanks for listening to the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I'm your host, Raina Lombardi. I'm very excited to welcome my next guest. Her name is Jane Ferris Richardson, and she's a board-certified art therapist and an active exhibiting artist. She's an associate professor and core faculty member in art therapy at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jane holds an EDD from BU School of Education, where she was managing editor of the Journal of Education. Her professional credentials include registered play therapist supervisor and licensed mental health counselor. Her recent book on art therapy and autism, Art as a Language for Autism, Creating Therapeutic Relationships with Children on the Autism Spectrum, was published in July by Routledge. Jane maintains a private practice with children and families with specialties in young children and children with special needs. She uses a developmentally based integrative approach to working with children, merging play and expressive approaches. Her approach is informed by her experience as a preschool educator, early childhood mental health consultant, and early intervention senior clinician. Lesley University has an ongoing relationship with the Reggio Emilia approach, and Jane has traveled to Reggio for an international study group on children with special rights, as well as participating in Reggio events locally. Her work with expressive languages for children with autism has led to her collaboration nationally and internationally in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Most recently, she taught a training for therapists, medical professionals, and parents of children with special needs in Delhi, India, and Dhaka, Bangladesh, and an Autism in the Arts workshop in Paris. Jane has published and presented on autism and art therapy, play therapy, and the importance of multiple languages for expression. She's also written about art therapy in Asia based on collaborations in China. Welcome, Jane. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Raina. It's good to be here.
So let's start by talking about your most recent book, Art as a Language for Autism. Can you share a little bit about what made you come up with that title? I think it's a really powerful title.
Wow. Thank you, Raina. And the way that you posed that question made me realize how important it was to touch on Reggio Emilia in my bio, because that is a way of considering children's expression, children's communication, children's learning that really stems directly from Reggio, where they talk about 100 languages and perhaps even more of children. And they discuss that very poetically, as well as pragmatically, thinking about, we use these languages to communicate, yes, but we also use them to dream and to imagine what might be possible. And in therapy, don't we want for children to be able to do that? Mm-hmm. So particularly for kids who might have an educational plan, they might have accommodations. Those things are extremely important, but they come with lots of expectations, and lots of measures, to see if they are achieving the components of the plan. So in therapy, I think it's even more important to, not have those limitations. Mm-hmm. For example, I have kids coming in, and perhaps they start off talking about something very concrete. And then, one day they'll say something like, I'm really thinking about black holes a lot. And it wakes me up at night. When you think about it, you have to be really intelligent to have that kind of, existential awareness, tinged with existential dread. And if you are a kid, even an older kid, and you're presenting with those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of preoccupations, we need to find a way to work through that and create more comfort. And the way that we do it could be through any number of languages. Sometimes it's art, and that's really powerful because you can alter the image, you can put the image away. I've had children ask me to put things in a file folder and log it in my file cabinet, and we only take it out if they really want it. And sometimes it's through play. The child who was afraid of black holes literally created the galaxy across my floor. It had everything. I have silk scarves. There were gases, evaporating. There were stones from the sand tray that were the asteroid belt. And then we went and we got my huge sphere ball. I have the largest size that you can go in. And he said, okay, this is going to be the black hole. And because it could expand and it could suck everything in, but he got to be in control of it. And that felt wonderful. And I wish I could say, and then he never worried about this again. That is not what happened, but he did gain perspective, which I think is a huge component of therapy. And children can have it too. This is not limited to adults. They develop perspective, they develop insight, different ways of thinking about something challenging, different ways of being with a challenging situation that is not going to go away. We're not going to change the universe in therapy, but we can change how it feels to be with that. Kind of a long answer.
No, I think it's a really great description of the importance of other ways of creating language, that the spoken word isn't the only language that we use, that there's so many different ways of communicating, and that it's important that we have all of these different options to explore and play in, because that is what helps us gain that different perspective, right? If we stay stuck in our own head, it's hard to kind of see that 360-degree view that you were able to have that space for your client to create of the galaxy and be immersed in that. I can see how that's a really powerful thing for kids. I love play too, and having that space, I think, is really important. Adults too. Right. For listeners that maybe aren't as familiar with early childhood education, can you give a little brief kind of origin of the Reggio Emilia approach? I only know it from early childhood education and a very unique kind of way of priming kids to move into school. But for folks that may have not heard of it before.
One of the most important things that I have taken to heart from Reggio inspiration, and inspiration is the way that this approach is often discussed, which is quite important because it is not a method to be replicated. It is a source of inspiration. But one of the ideas that's been generated there is a way of looking at children, all children, but because I work so much with children who here have been labeled children with special needs. In Reggio, these children are talked about as children with special rights, and they actually get to sign up for preschool programs before everybody else. So, their rights are really being upheld. And I felt that was a very important concept to share, just because children come to us with so many expectations attached, even if they are quite little. And some of those expectations are really important because they keep us accountable as adults, to make sure that we're supporting them in all the ways that we need to make sure that they're learning. And I would add, hopefully also having fun while they're learning. But it's important to have that more open-ended sense of possibility. And I think that is a significant thing that we can give children in the kind of therapy that we do as art therapists.
Yeah, that important element of the child directing what's happening in the room, and that ability to choose, having that autonomy.
And choice is so important, Raina, because sometimes kids are not really very good at making choices, you know, and also they may not be accustomed to adults telling them they can choose, because we do have so many expectations.
That's true. And especially for young ones that are really struggling to fit within kind of our societal constructs, then it makes it even harder, because everything seems like it's forced upon them. Makes it real challenging. So with the work that you do, specifically with children with autism, what are some of the kind of core components that you explore in the book for developing those really meaningful relationships?
So that's such a wonderful question. And it's almost as if what I'm exploring with children is what is going to be the avenue for that relationship. So we're not just sitting in chairs looking at one another. The environment is really important. In Reggio, they talk about the environment as the third teacher. So there are lots of cues that children get from the environment about what is possible for them. They also learn some things about me through the environment. And kids are such great observers. And once in a while, they'll say, for example, Dr. Jane, you really like rainbows, don't you? I really like rainbows too. And it's so lovely when there's that kind of resonance, that they find something they care about and they realize that I like it. So the environment is really important in terms of giving permission to explore. And another very, very important way in is through materials. You know, as art therapists, we love art materials. And I have many in my office, and the choice is very open. You know, with the exception that certain things I might have on a high shelf that I don't want, say, a 3.5-year-old to get into, unless they're very, very focused. You know, I do make exceptions about materials. If someone is sitting at the table and they're super focused and they need something like a teensy little jar of acrylic paint for whatever it is they're trying to do, like paint a dot that is not working with tempera and it wouldn't work with gouache, you know, I will say, oh, I have this other special thing, let's try that. So, you know, the limits are not absolute, but they absolutely are there. And so the materials themselves are like languages. You know, within the world of art as a language, I mean, you could think about clay as a language. And I often think that we don't do enough with clay in art therapy. It's heavy, it's messy, you need to clean it up, you need to store it. If you don't have a kiln, as I do not, it's kind of fragile. But what I have found is that stories come out in clay that sometimes do not through any kind of 2D work. So, for example, when kids are making clay figures, sometimes I will make a little teeny tiny one as well. At the same time, I do them really, really simple so that kids are not intimidated. For example, one kid made a fabulous Godzilla, and I made baby Godzilla, a teeny tiny baby Godzilla. And this child was captivated, and there started to be an interaction between the clay figures. These particular ones, we had used that very soft, bright colored plasticine, so they weren't going to break. And I've discovered you can play with those, and they'll keep for a while if you try and keep the dust off. So he, came over to meet the baby Godzilla. And this was really significant because, like so many kids that I see, this kid was really, really so bright and so observant, and also quite wrapped up in, or maybe the better word is absorbed in, his interests.
Yeah.
And here is a place where he was making this overture saying, I want to meet this baby Godzilla. What's going to happen here? And it turned out to be something that we would come back to. So not only can there be that kind of interaction, but you can create a little world in a way. There's a picture in the book that I love. I do love the pictures, and I'm grateful that I was able to put as many as I did. But I'll try and describe this. And the best way to imagine it is if you hold up your hand and you kind of cup it and you hold your fingers up. The palm of your hand was like the floor of a forest, and the fingers are like trees. And that's what this little boy made. So he made this forest, and I made an exception to my rule about what we use in art making, because he wanted some of my worry dolls, which were really not intended to be there to put into your art process, but I completely got it. And he took the little worry dolls and he put them in, walking through the forest together. It was like being in a fairy tale. It was like looking at Hansel and Gretel wandering through the woods and wondering what was going to come next. So it was so dramatic. It was such an interaction of these two little children. And there came to be a whole story about what they were doing and where they were going. And of course, children tell stories about their drawings. I have kids that I make books with, or we do like sections of a book. And children who don't feel comfortable just kind of narrating their experience will put it into the book or into the picture. But this was so evocative, and partly because we could literally, sit and look into it and look through it. We could look through the little trees.
Very cool. I love that. I find that children have like an intuitive sense of what they need to do in the space if we do allow them that freedom to explore. And I'm always fascinated by the narratives that surface, and how, you were saying, like with the plasticine figurines of the Godzilla, how that would come back and reemerge into the work. I'm always fascinated by that when you're working with kids over a long period of time, how something that they visited at one juncture in the therapeutic process kind of takes a back seat for a while and then resurfaces later in a different way. And it's just interesting how their stories evolve.
They really do. And part of what that means for us as therapists, practically as well as philosophically, is we need to hold that. We need to literally hold that. I needed to make a little place to put the Godzillas where they were going to be safe, where no one else was going to see them and want to play with them, but to have them be accessible to the child.
Yeah. So with the work that you're doing with kids and their families, do you touch about that in the book, like pulling the family into the work that you're doing with the children? Yeah. In what ways do you do that?
Mm-hmm. I actually do that a lot in practice. And it's interesting that I don't talk about it quite as much in the book, because there was so much to say about children.
Mm-hmm.
There are some places, though, and I think these are very important, where the inclusion of parents, the involvement of parents, the engagement of parents in art making and in play, because that's part of what I do, aside from consulting with parents. There are two places in particular where that came in, and one is when I was talking about the importance of integrating in different approaches. I have done some children's yoga teacher training, some of it focused explicitly on neurodiverse kids, and it was wonderful and really a good resource. And while I don't all of a sudden start to teach a yoga class in the middle of a session, I borrow things. And what I use the most is approaches to relaxation and building focus. And sometimes we involve parents with that. And I actually put this in the book because it's so lovely. And if it were not therapy, and if the work was not privileged in the way that it is, it would be lovely to have a video of this right now, because this little boy, who at that time was about 8, had been willing to practice some relaxation, very, very high energy child. And he decided it would be okay, with a little bit of urging, to invite his parents in and to teach them how to do this. So what good sports? I do have big floor pillows that can get you comfortable. So the child and I set this up on the floor, and we went down to the waiting room to get his parents, and they came in, and they got settled on the floor, and I was over on the side, and the little boy was closer to them. And he had a little story to read to them. And I remember him saying, looking at them and smiling and saying, "Now breathe, mommy and daddy." And he watched them to,
Mm-hmm.
to see if there's actually some movement, if they really are visibly breathing. And then he read them a very brief little story to guide them through relaxation. And I have also had children do that with younger siblings. I remember one really remarkable day that a child invited his mother and a sibling in, and they transformed the room, and they put on the floor all the things that were on the ground. So they got fish puppets and frog puppets, and they made a pond out of my giant blue stretch cloth. And they had deer coming to drink in the pond, and they had trees from the sand tray. And then they took all the chairs and they said, okay, this is going to be the sky. And they took puffy things, blue and white things, and they made clouds, and they, sat birds up there and other things in the sky. So they created this whole environment to relax in. I thought that is so marvelous, and not something I ever would have thought of, in terms of, and that's why I suppose I have trouble with directives. I'm not crazy about that word rather. I would never have imagined that. Mm-hmm. Now I know that it's possible. And I think that my vocabulary of what's possible really expands through working with children. So I can kind of have in the back of my mind, I wonder maybe if this would happen. So it can be very, very important to children that their parents witness things.
Yes.
I do a lot with the sand tray, and I find that the transitions from the sand to art making can really be wonderful. But one child had a very complicated story about his sand tray. And at a certain point, he stopped and made up a song. Mm-hmm. And then he repeated the song. And he looked at me and he said, do you have that? Do you have that chorus? And I'd been writing everything down as I'd been observing. So we practiced. And then he said, okay, now we're going to go sing this to mom. Wow. So I went out into the waiting area with this child. It's oh, I'm going to sing in front of his mother. I do like to sing. And, he kind of gave the nod. We're going to start. And we sang the chorus of this song together to this mother. So I thought that was very significant. He really wanted me to witness. He really wanted me to get it, that it was important to him. And he wanted to share with his mother, and he wanted to help me. He wanted rather for me to help him do that and support him.
So cool. I feel like a lot of times in our work with children, sometimes it's easy to not include the parents, but you can see that the children really want their parents included. They want to bring them in. They want their parents to witness and see their world in the way that they see it. And it's hard sometimes when the parents don't necessarily want to engage in that way.
Yes. Yes. I know that I was describing when we were connecting at the beginning, how I clear off this art table, which is quite big, and I'll cover the whole thing with a big roll of paper, and maybe I'll sit on one end, and then the child and the parent will sit across from each other and they will draw together, or they will go down onto the floor. And I do think that it's important for children and parents to have those experiences together. And it certainly is a part of how I work. The other way that I brought it into the book is that I did a series of interviews with a wonderful mom who also happens to be a professional musician. She's a percussionist and an autism professional and educator, and the mother of a son who is autistic, Jen Damien. And I did a whole series of interviews with Jen. And that is a chapter of the book. And the title of the chapter comes from something that she said, because she conceptualized what we're talking about so well. She said, you know, experience becomes a doorway. Isn't that wonderful? And in a way, I think that is what I try to provide for parents and children together, you know, just like come through that door and get a glimpse of this world that is going on in here, and through which we can actually touch on all these things that brought your child to therapy. So that's the leap, because we know, we believe, we expect that this is going to happen and that this change is going to come, even though we're working in a way that is child-centered or perhaps child-focused, which to me means bringing in some other elements, like saying, why don't we try relaxing now? Children don't necessarily spontaneously ask for those things. So I think that the way that we work in treatment provides a lot of opportunities for children. It also provides opportunities for parents. And I did a project years ago where I had parents come in. I gave them a free Santre session, you know, completely apart from insurance or goals or expectations. But I wanted them to come in and do a Santre that had something to do with their relationship with their child. It was absolutely fascinating because, of course, the other thing that always came in was their relationship with themselves. So they were seeing from the inside how this process works.
Oh, I love that. Which I think there's so much, what's the word? I'm at a loss for word, but that experience gives them a greater understanding and capacity for the work that the child is doing through the playful process and creation process, which sometimes, you know, I think can be really challenging. I know on a couple of occasions over the years, I've had parents say, well, when is the real therapy going to happen? You know, when is the play stuff going to end? Because there's this, even though we've talked about it, you know, and provide the education of the value and importance of the work of play and the work of the creative process, to the child and their development and their learning to understand what's going on with themselves. There's still that, I think, entrenched kind of societal perspective of therapy occurs when one is sitting on a couch and having this dialogue with another person, that it's all talk. And sometimes the most transformative therapeutic moments in my career, I think, have been where there has been no words at all.
Yes. And that is, I think, sort of an undercurrent, throughout the book, because not only is it possible that someone will say no thank you to every possible art material, even if we're an art therapist, it's also completely possible that there won't be any speaking.
Yeah.
At least not out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is communication. And I think we're learning from the autism community how important that is. There, very recently, there's been a story out about a college valedictorian who gave their address, who is a non-speaking autistic person.
Wow.
Yeah. I wish I could remember which school it was.
That's amazing.
But I know, so it's in California. I know a lovely young woman who is a special needs teacher. And she was so thrilled. She said, oh, that child used to go to my school when they were a child. Yeah. Wow. So I think that when we embrace the breadth of communication, the whole possible range, people's potential, kind of floats to the top in a different kind of way. And here's an example on a preschool level. I was working with a child who did speak, just not all that much at that particular time. Mm-hmm. And he made up voices for things that he was playing with, and they were wonderful and they were very distinct. And my office is in my house, and the waiting area is outside the door. I have this wonderful little curved wall in my room. That's part of why I bought the house. I thought, oh, a nice curved wall. That's great for a therapy office. And in the hall, there's a little sofa that fits into the curve, and there's a toy cupboard. And there is sound privacy, and there are sound machines, and you can't hear the words people are saying. But there was a mother sitting outside while he was making up the voices, and she could tell that, there something was modulated like differently. And we came out, and she looked at us and she said, was he making voices? And I said, yes. And what struck us was that these characters, they really did have a voice, mm-hmm. And it was not words, but it was their personality, their way of interaction. And that was a pretty exciting moment. And if I were, tracking progress towards IEP goals, mm-hmm. I would be able to kind of configure that and make it fit in. But I do that process backwards.
Oh, share a little bit more.
In a way of saying, wow, let's point out to everyone how really tapping in to this sort of creative process moves you forward towards those goals, rather than saying, here's the goal, let's go through these scripted steps to get there.
I like that. I like that a lot. I know we have to create these plans, and it's part of kind of the scientific model of treatment, but oftentimes I feel like you do it, but you're not necessarily going through it, because it feels so antithetical to what the individual needs and the journey that they have to go on to get to accomplishing whatever the goals are. It's so interesting, like the paradoxes.
Right, because we do need to be accountable. We owe that to our children. And that's why we're not, I'm doing air quotes here, we're not just drawing, we're not just playing. We are really, trying to respect and support the child and enable movement,
Mm-hmm.
in therapy and in their lives, because, they go out into the world, and hopefully there is something of a ripple effect in terms of how they are received in the world. And that's another piece that only comes a teensy bit into the book, is what happens with schools, trying to build understanding of the child's strengths as well as their needs. There are a couple of little stories about that, but
yeah, I think that's
very
really
important.
because so much of the focus ends up being on what's not working well, right? We're giving so much attention to what's not working well that we're like almost reinforcing it in some capacity, instead of finding what is their zone of genius and where are they really shining, and how do we reinforce that, so that they start to develop that really positive sense of self and possibility for themselves, versus getting real stuck in the box of, well, this is what's happening and therefore I can't, which I often see in a lot of the kids that I work with over the years, especially when they can get in that real binary trap of thinking of the black and white or always never kind of stuff. It makes it really hard. So
Right, almost as if they're wanting an answer, so the answer is no. We want to shift that, and it's kind of related to client-centered work, and that regard for the person that you're working with. We really want kids to feel that themselves, rather than judging, oh, the last X number of times I tried to do this thing, it didn't work. And I think that is a hugely important element of the work we do.
Yeah. And I think when possible, if we are doing that collaborative piece with educators, really helping them to understand some of those concepts too. And I feel like the special education programming has shifted a lot, and does integrate more opportunities for expression in that work, but there's always room for more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about some of the ways you've explored integrating other approaches with the art in the work that you do with children with autism, that maybe you talk about in the book, or maybe you don't, but I know that you use an integrative approach. What are some of the other things that maybe we haven't discussed in our conversation today?
In a sense, we've discussed balance, but I feel that that is really important. And, one way that conceptually it has become clearer to me is thinking about being child focused, really focused on the child, but willing to bring in experiences that perhaps the child is not seeking out for themselves. Things like relaxation, things like, a fairly gentle push to explore a new material that I have a sense could work really well for them, or an invitation, say, to move when they're feeling stuck, or to listen to some music, which they can choose. So bringing in a wider range of expressive experiences and possibilities. And also, I think it's important to give kids a sense of what it is they're doing and learning, and that they are learning things, and that they are doing things that are new, and it's kind of exciting. For example, I have this stuffed brain in a basket that's very easily findable. Sometimes kids think it's a blue whale. I'm located in New Bedford, Massachusetts, from where Herman Melville shipped out. So we talk about whales a lot here. Kids all know about whales, but it's not a blue whale. And I have this brain, and I have a little stuffed smiling heart. And what I have found is that even quite young kids, when we take these out, get this idea that we have to use both of them. Wow. This so connects to some of the current research about relational neurobiology.
Yes.
And, on this preschool level, given the materials, kids get this in a way.
Fascinating.
And it is. And, sometimes spontaneously they'll go pull these things out. But I deliberately go and get them to talk about this. I also have a little stuffed stomach, and I had a little kindergarten girl who just would grab that by herself, and she would carry it around the room like it was a stuffed animal. And she said, "This is my favorite thing." And, she was struggling with eating. It was fascinating. So she gravitated to that. But
wow,
sometimes there's that kind of mirroring, and, people are just honing in on what they need. And sometimes we're making this gentle suggestion to look at things in a different way. And one thing I realized in writing the book is how interested I am in metaphor. And looking around at the things that I've got on my table in the room, lots and lots of props. Some of them are toys, some of them are other things that explain challenges that we see in therapy in a metaphorical way. Like, for example, also sitting on my table, I have a baby owl puppet, and they swivel their head 360. And we play with that to talk about being hyper vigilant. And we can do it in the most comfortable. There's also a parent owl who's bigger. So that's really fascinating. And I find that the things that I have that allow me to explore challenges on that level have been incredibly valuable. And another thing I have learned as an art therapist is it's so wonderful to create images, and sometimes people are not ready. So to have something that you can actually put your hand on that embodies what you wish you could make, and maybe you'll make it the next time. That often happens. To find something that you resonate with, that's really, really valuable.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize until I wrote the book, which I've worked on for many years, how important that is to me, and how valuable these things are. And some of these things I've literally taken all over the world with me because they are such great examples. Like the little owl has been on several continents.
It's funny how, we can have so many options of therapeutic tools in our space, but there are just probably a handful that, we gravitate to simply because they get used the most frequently. And you go, okay, that's getting a lot of play here. There's something really significant that's resonating for a variety of people, and those become, the cherished items. And I think it's easy sometimes to think, oh, like I can't do this work because I don't have enough supplies or whatever. But it's okay to have just a few, because if they resonate, they'll work. But then there's also the imagination, where if it's not available, they'll create it. They'll create the metaphor that they need if it's not available.
I once did a session when a kid would not come in my room. And I happened to have Post-it notes in my pocket, and I had a pen. And they had a pen. And we went and sat in a hallway. This was in another office. And the child did this whole series of drawings. And because it was Post-it notes, we could put them up on the wall, and rearrange them to tell a story. And it was quite amazing, because to say that she was feeling disaffected that day, would be a big understatement. But by the end, we had a whole wall full of drawings that were meaningful.
That's so cool. Yeah. Just being flexible and open and using non-traditional supplies.
Right. Because we're using ourselves, and we're working through the relationship. And that being said, I have an old friend who's an artist. And when they came in to the office and looked at the sand tray shelves, they said, "This is probably more than you need, right? This feels like an art installation." And I thought that was so wonderful, because the way that I was trained in sand tray by Gisela Di Domenico values very much that the therapist should be able to play with their own collection. It should not just be a bunch of little plastic doodads in a box. It should be something really rich.
Right. A lot of diversity in the selection, and things that you like, things that you don't like. Yeah. And I think that there's that room to edit, right? Like we don't want it so big that it becomes overwhelming to somebody to come in the space, that there's so much that they become dysregulated. And yet we want to have enough of a diverse selection that there's options for people to find what they need to say what they need in the sand.
Right.
Yeah.
That everything has to be contained, within the space, within the shelves, within yourself.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Jane, for folks that might be interested in purchasing your book, where is it currently available?
Well, I had a huge thrill this morning. I learned that the Brown University bookstore, which is down the road from me in Providence, has it in stock. I just have been emailing bookstores to say, are you interested in this book? And they said, oh, we've already got it.
That's awesome.
So I would encourage people to go into their local bookstore and say, I'd like to have this book. Because particularly after these last couple of years I think it's important to support these places in our community. That being said, I shared a coupon from the wonderful Self-Esteem shop.
Yes, love them.
When I asked them if they would be interested in carrying the book, within about 15 minutes, they sent me back a money off coupon with free shipping. So
awesome.
The online option is out there, and that is the one that I would recommend. But it seems to be more available. It's in for anybody who has Lesley connections. It's in the Lesley Library as an ebook. Unlimited numbers of people can read it at once. And some of the other schools with art therapy programs have it as well.
Awesome. Well, I will definitely put the link to the book coupon with the Self-Esteem shop in the show notes for folks that would like to take advantage of that offer. And if people would want to reach out to you for anything, where can they find you?
I have to confess that my website needs lots of updating. It has wonderful children's art pictures. It does not misrepresent in any way what I do, but it doesn't have all the information about more recent things. It is possible to email me through the website, and it also is perfectly fine to send me an email directly.
Okay. And the website would be www.transformative.info.
Yes.
So if anybody would like to reach out to Jane, you can find more information about her there. And it's okay. Websites are constantly they're dynamic. They're constantly evolving. And I'm sure you've been working on lots of other things to keep it all going.
I have been, and I do have an author page through an organization called All About Psychology, and that is beautifully organized with lots of links, although not one to directly contact me.
Okay. Well, I will look that up and I'll add that into the show notes as well. But
I'm happy to hear from people. Because of course, my intention in writing this book is to provide a resource for other therapists, thinking about the things that I didn't know when I started doing this work, and really how little information was out there about what others had done.
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect of what we need to be doing, right? Like constantly connecting with others to share how we're working with different populations of people. I think in particular for individuals with autism, that range is so diverse and unique. And there are multiple different ways of working, but it doesn't seem to be like there's a rich treasure trove of resources for art therapists in particular on that topic. So,
although there certainly are some, and I've drawn on those resources in the book, a lot of references. And so I haven't tried to replicate what anyone else has already done. But the work of other art therapists, the work of play therapists has been really valuable. But I've been doing this work a long time, more than half my life. And when I started, there really was nothing to read. So I thought about, what would I have liked to have read
back then
when I was beginning?
Well, thank you for creating that and sharing that with us. And, I hope that many people find it accessible and helpful in their practice with the clients that they serve. And thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, Raina. And I hope that if people do find this helpful, or if they have questions, that they will let me know.
Okay, wonderful. I will encourage them to do that in our write-up as well. So, thank you. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Jane. I know I did, and I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm excited to check out and dive deeper into her book. Don't forget to go to the show notes to get the book coupon, which is available through the Self-Esteem Shop. And if you wanted to go to that link, it's https://selfesteemshop.com/product/art-as-a-language-for-autism/. And that'll get you a little discount. Stay creative, and I'll talk with you next week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.